Hey everybody. Hello, hello. How's everyone doing out there? Thank you so much for being with us today. We have a really important topic to talk about, which, if you've been following the news, there was likely another really concerning development with overnight. And I want to bring in a guest right now to talk a little bit more about. Let's see if he's able to join me. There he is. Viet, how are you?
Good. How are you, Anna?
I'm really, really well. Everyone, I'm just saying hi to all our audience out there. I am joined, of course, by Viet Thanh Nguyen, the award-winning author, Pulitzer Prize-winning author behind his debut novel in 2015, The Sympathizer. Of course, his new novel out now, The Committed, and we have a lot to talk about. Viet, I'm so grateful to you for making the time. How are you doing today?
Well, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I wish it was under better circumstances. I mean, we knew obviously that what we're going to talk about was going to be very topical, but just what happened yesterday has just been sending shockwaves through me, but through everybody in the Asian American community, and of course anybody else who cares about anti-Asian violence. And yes, I'm devastated, of course, and just ready to talk about some difficult issues.
Well, we should share in the way of background for everyone out there joining us. And thank you for being here. I see a bunch of folks joining now, and send us your questions. We'll try to get to them as we go here as well. Viet and I have talked a number of times before on this very topic, on a number of other issues around race and Asian American identity and community in America. And we'd set up this conversation days ago because it's just something that needs to be talked about. And then, of course, overnight, we have the horrifying news out of Atlanta about a mass shooting. 8 people, authorities say, have been killed. 6 of those 8 victims are Asian women. And we're still learning a lot about the attacker, about motives, and all of that. But of course, in a year when there's been this incredible rise of anti-Asian American violence and hate incidents, it's devastating, right, Viet?
Absolutely devastating. And of course, there's already attempts to put, we have to be cautious. We don't know exactly what took place. More information will be revealed, as you say, but I can't help but locate this event in a much wider pattern of the anti-Asian violence that you're talking about, but also a much longer history of anti-Asian violence as well. So, I mean, people who may not know a lot about Asian Americans may be surprised at incidents like this, but those of us who are familiar with Asian American history know that Asians have been targeted for violence in this country as long as there have been Asian immigrants in this country. I'm coming to you from Los Angeles. In 1871, 17 Chinese men and boys were lynched in downtown Los Angeles in one of the largest mass lynchings, perhaps the largest mass lynching in American history. That was just one incident. It was not isolated. And we can spend a lot of time just talking about the whole chain of events that have taken place over the last 150 years, at the very least, of this kind of violence directed against Asian Americans.
And I want to point people to something you've been doing even really regularly, but this morning on Twitter, I saw you had an incredible thread laying out some of that even more recent history that I think sometimes gets buried because it happens infrequently and has a real impact within the community because we pay attention to it when it affects your friends and people who look like you and your friends and family. But it doesn't often get the attention until it happens in much larger numbers or much more frequently. But you did a really wonderful job kind of pulling it all together, pointing out it was in the late 90s, or late 80s rather, that there was a mass shooting of school children in California. It was in the mid 2000s when there was a massacre at a Sikh house of worship, right? So this is not something that happened a while ago and there's infrequent events tying it together. This has continuously happened in American history.
Absolutely. The Stockton schoolyard shooting you're referring to happened, I think, in 1989. And that was 5 Southeast Asian school children. This was long before, the later school shootings that took place. This might have been the first schoolyard shooting in the history of the United States. And these children were definitely being targeted because they were Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees from the Vietnam War. So I think we as Asian Americans, are often situated today in contemporary discourse as somehow being safe. We're the model minority. We are successful in college, et cetera, et cetera. And people are not aware of the fact that there's huge diversity in the Asian American population. There are a lot of poor Asian Americans, a lot of Asian Americans living in vulnerable economic situations, and they're ripe for this kind of violence. But the violence itself extends obviously beyond those kinds of circumstances, so that in the wave of anti-Asian violence that we're seeing, anybody can be targeted. And I think that's That's just an additional level of shock and visibility that we see people like Asian American elders in Chinatown, in presumably safe environments, in their driveways in San Jose, being, pushed, shoved, attacked, physically assaulted, or at least verbally assaulted, is completely unacceptable. And the Asian American community is absolutely right in being outraged about these things.
So I want to share some information for any folks who are just getting up to speed on this. A couple of things I want to point out. One, my colleagues Stephanie Tsai and Leah Nagy had a fantastic report on the NewsHour last night. I encourage everyone to go online and check it out because it really did get to the heart of what is happening inside the Asian American community, how we should be looking at this increase, this surge of anti-Asian violence, and what it feels like right now for many of the families who are living, quite frankly, in fear, afraid to go out and live their lives in the ways that they used to. But here are some of the numbers, and this is why it needs to be paid attention to. There's a group called Stop AAPI Hate that's basically been gathering self-reported data. So this is probably underreported because you're relying on people stepping up to say, this happened to me or someone I know. From mid-March of last year, basically from the beginning of the pandemic until February of this year, they received nearly 4,000 reports of racism and discrimination against Asian Americans, women reporting hate incidents at a rate of more than almost 2.5 more times than men. Yeah, when you hear that number, knowing some of the videos that you've seen out there, some of the stories I'm sure you're hearing yourself, what is your reaction?
My reaction is that, again, these things have been taking place for a very long time. I think many of us who are Asian Americans can point to our own lives and point to our own history of encountering, at the very least, low-level anti-Asian racism. My own life, for example, my parents opened the second Vietnamese grocery store in San Jose, California in 1978 as Vietnamese refugees, which is what you're supposed to do, coming to this country and pursue the American dream. And lo and behold, I walk down the street as a 10-year-old kid and see a sign in a window that says, "Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese." So that sign, I didn't understand it then, but I understand it now, to be a story that's been repeated constantly throughout American history. Another American driven out of business by fill in the blank. Now, the reason that Chinese immigrants were being targeted in the 19th century is that they were being positioned by the media and by politicians as a threat to the white working class. So that stimulation of anti-Asian feeling to distract attention away from economic fallout has always been a part of American history. Not long after that sign appeared actually before that sign appeared in that store window, Vincent Chin was killed in Detroit by two Detroit auto workers who were white, who thought Vincent Chin, who was Chinese American, was Japanese, which he was not. And they blamed him for the Japanese economic competition that was taking place. And there was intensely heated rhetoric about a trade war with Japan at the time. So we as Asian Americans have never been insulated from the anti-Asian feeling that the United States every now and then promotes towards Asian countries with which it feels competition. So I think it's really important to point out that besides domestic racism that's happening here in the United States, anti-Asian feeling in general throughout the United States is stimulated by this kind of rhetoric. And now we're at a time when 3 successive presidential administrations, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now the Biden administration, have taken on this stance that China is our enemy and our major competitor. And while that rhetoric has varied from the explicitly racist during the Trump administration to much more moderate rhetoric in the Biden administration, I can't help but feel that there's blowback coming from that stance against Asian Americans as a whole.
Well, this gets to one of the questions that someone out there sent to us. And again, guys, anyone out there, please do send us your questions because I understand this is a complex topic and I know a lot of you are thinking about it and figuring out how to process it. But on that political rhetoric issue, yet someone is asking, can you attribute the rise in anti-Asian hate back to Presidents Trump or Obama? What is the history of this? How do you see that link between what gets said from the highest office in the land and what we see unfolding on the streets?
Well, my feeling is that what's happening now is that we're in a really obviously tense environment because of the pandemic. People are economically stressed, they're psychologically stressed, and so on. And it didn't help that under the Trump administration, it was free game to say, hey, the COVID-19 is the China virus and Kung flu, which both blames China for the origins of the virus, which might be true, but which connects it to this deep well of anti-Asian feeling as symbolized in Kung flu. Now, everybody who is Asian in this country has heard this before. Now, even if you haven't been a direct target of anti-Asian physical violence, we have all been targeted by long distance racism. In other words, I grew up in the 70s and 80s watching all these Vietnam War movies, and the place of the Vietnamese was to be mocked and before they were killed and to be silenced. And in general, that anti-Asian feeling was there throughout American popular culture in terms of comedies, for example, and in political discourse and in radio shock jock commentary. So there's nothing new. Kung Flu just puts its finger on that button and presses it over and over and over again. So I think that was the immediate trigger for what we're experiencing now. But again, the low-level anti-Asian racism has always been with us, and now it's a part of our foreign policy discussion about China. And everybody's hearing it and absorbing that feeling and that phobia against the Chinese. And because presumably all Asians look the same to a lot of non-Asian people, all Asians are targeted as a result of that.
You know, you mentioned earlier that America as a country has been slow to sort of recognize that Asian Americans need to be part of our larger conversations about race and racial reckoning and the disparities across the races, and that this enormous group of Asian Americans, which is the most diverse racial group in America, sort of the success of a few sometimes masks the struggles of the many within that enormously diverse group. But I'm curious what you think has happened recently. As we know, there are now numbers behind a lot of these hate incidents. They're getting more attention. There are videos, horrifying videos of people being attacked in the streets. Do you think that there's enough of a response from local governments and state leaders and other officials? You think they're doing enough to respond to it in the right way?
I have no idea whether they're doing enough. I mean, certainly just speaking out is obviously very crucial. So thankfully, yes, now Asian Americans constitute about 5.6% of the American population. We're a larger percentage than we ever have been before. That gives us slightly more visibility and more ability to speak out. And of course, now we have Asian American celebrities and political representatives to amplify our cause. And of course, yes, certain individuals are stepping up to speak out. So I am thankful that President Biden did say, this is wrong, what's happening, which is, you know, I give him credit for it, but it's the least an American president can do. Now, there are obviously short-term solutions that people are looking for and begging for, but we also have to acknowledge that we need long-term solutions as well. The reason why we have a constant repetition, periodic eruptions of anti-Asian violence is that we've never addressed the roots of anti-Asian violence in this country that we're talking about today. So I think about, you know, what has just happened here. The latest report that I've read is that the shooter claims that he did not target these women because they were Asian. He has a sex addiction problem, and he was taking care of his problem. But of course he targeted these women because they were Asian. How do Asian women end up in massage parlors to which non-Asian men are attracted? It's a whole environment of targeting Asian women first as sexual objects of desire and then as objects of racial fear and hate. They're completely interconnected. So beyond questions of short-term solutions, we also need to be thinking about gun control, obviously very controversial, anti-racist education. We don't have enough anti-racist education in this country, and a lot of it is prioritized towards other groups rather than Asian Americans. We should be prioritizing all groups, including Asian Americans, in this anti-racist education and in this anti-racist campaign. And instead of just putting out rhetoric, city leaders, school leaders, political leaders need to make sure that we're building an infrastructure that educates people about the history and the place of Asian Americans in this country and the long-standing existence of anti-Asian rhetoric and racism and how to identify that and defeat that.
Tell me a little bit more about that, because this is something I think a lot of people in the headlines and the videos and so on, we don't often carry this conversation far enough. What specifically do you think, when you're talking about anti-racist education, what's not happening now in the way that we are educated about our history growing up that you think should happen?
Well, I think in general, from what I understand, anti-racist education is not very strong in this country in general. I mean, in certain universities, you have ethnic studies and you have anti-racist courses and things like that. But look at what's happening at the level of national discourse. I mean, we've been struggling collectively as people of color in this country to bring up all these issues that I'm talking about and the importance of intersectional awareness, that you can't separate out what happens to Asian Americans, to what happens to Black people, and to Indigenous people, and so on and so forth. And when we bring up these issues, there are so many people out there ready to say, hey, you're just being woke, you're being oversensitive, intersectionality is just further racism. So when we bring up anti-racism, people are accusing us of being racist for talking about race. It's ridiculous. And so we as a country have not even made a down payment on anti-racist education yet. And I'm pretty sure that below the level of the universities, where much of this anti-racist conversation is marginally taking place, at the level of K through 12 education, I'm pretty sure it's mostly not taking place, that students are not getting as a normative, normal experience an anti-racist curriculum. How many people out there in the K through 12 curriculum are having an exposure to the histories of diverse peoples in this country, which is a positive, and a focus on the negative history of this country in terms of the deep-seated roots of racism, which in my mind is not incidental or accidental, but is fundamental to the history of the United States.
I have to say, it's still remarkable to me sometimes when we reference these things in our reporting and our conversations as parts of our history that we know and acknowledge, which is the Chinese Exclusion Act, that mass lynching you referenced earlier, the murder of Vincent Chin. These are not things I think that most Americans are certainly aware of, and certainly not taught in a formal way in this country. I want to make sure I get to a few more questions because people have them coming in, and guys, please send them, keep them coming because we will try to get to them. Yet someone wants to know, what can we do as Asian American youth to protect ourselves and our loved ones? First of all, it breaks my heart that someone out there thinks they have to ask that question. And I'm so sorry that people out there feel that way, but this is a very real concern. People want to know what they should be doing for themselves. Yeah, what would you say?
I feel for that person. I went home to visit my 86-year-old father in San Jose just this past weekend. And when we left the house just to go on a shopping errand, the thought crossed my mind, what if we're in danger? Not for me, myself, but my 86-year-old father. I see him in these older people who have been assaulted and killed just for being who they are. It's terrifying. I don't really have an easy answer for the questioner. You know, obviously, we all should be speaking up. We all should be trying to take care of each other. We should be aware on the streets. We should not be letting people get a pass when they discuss Asian Americans in a certain way. In other words, we need to be laying the groundwork now, each of us, for the future, because as I've said, this is repetitious. This is not the first time we've seen this kind of violence. It's not the last time we're going to see this kind of violence. So yes, we're all kind of scared right now in terms of what we can do immediately, but we should all be preparing for the future, which means that even in our everyday social interactions, we cannot let comments that demean Asian Americans and situate them in a certain way to pass. Now, this can be explicitly racist commentary or sexist commentary. And as I've said, the racism and the sexism and the homophobia all intersect along with class fears and class competitions. But oftentimes the comments may seem more innocuous, either, mildly anti-Asian jokes, or comments that, well, now you know what it's like to be the targets of racism in the United States. We've always known what it's been like to be the targets of racism in the United States. Or, Asian Americans have it so good. We need each of us in our own individual ways not to be the stereotypical silent Asian American who accepts whatever's been given to them and who will laugh or pretend that nothing has happened when people make these mildly or explicitly anti-Asian comments and observations. Each of us has to step forward, has to speak out, has to begin the education with the people around us. So that's a collective effort that we need to do to prepare ourselves for the next wave or next incident of anti-Asian violence.
So this is a related question, but I think something a lot of people are asking themselves, especially these days, because we've all seen these hashtags, right? Stop Asian hate, stop AAPI hate. Obviously, these stories, the videos getting a lot of attention, the growing numbers. But someone out there is asking, what can we do in real life? What can we do in real life, not with a hashtag and not on social media, to help? Right. I think you just referenced a little bit of that, which is to just speak up, take up space. Like when you say something, when you see something, say something.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want anybody out there to be in the physical situation where they're going to be targeted like this. I mean, there's no easy, what we do in each of those situations, we have to defend ourselves best that we can. But look, I mean, there have been ways by which the individual actions have been actually fairly crucial. People have been recording these incidents. They've been amplifying these incidents. They've been stepping up and speaking out when they see other people being targeted by these incidents. Now, that's really crucial. If you happen to find yourself witnessing something like this, again, either speak out or actually intervene and defend the other person. I remember, here's another personal incident. Just in Berkeley, one of the most liberal cities in the world, as a college student, I was in a photocopy shop owned by a South Asian man. White gentleman comes in, berates this South Asian gentleman because of whatever minor infraction or lack of service he felt he was getting, just went off on a whole tirade. And I had to step in and say something, even though I was just a bystander at that point. And the white gentleman was so upset, he just stormed out. And the South Asian owner said, "Thank you for speaking up for me and stepping in between." Each of us can do these kinds of things. Now, outside of that, I'm active in different kinds of organizations. These organizations already exist. Asian American activists have been doing this work for decades, building community organizations, both that are specific to their ethnic communities and that are pan-Asian as well. If you really want to help, there are so many organizations that you can join or contribute to, right? So there's actually no excuse for a lack of political engagement or activist work. There are grassroots organizations that are springing up all over the place saying, hey, we're going to defend Asian Americans by escorting elderly people to the supermarket, by standing guard in front of our neighbors' homes. Those exist. So if you want to, go to your Facebook neighborhood page or your Nextdoor page, start speaking out, start organizing, do that kind of work, or join an already existing organization. You mentioned Stop AAPI Hate. That's a good place to start there, to start looking at other organizations that already have an online presence. I guarantee you they exist. So if you're really angry or really motivated or really fearful, the worst thing that you can do, I think, is just to sit alone in your own fear. That's the worst thing. You know, solidarity, speaking up, getting involved, becoming aware that you are not alone, but that you are part of an Asian American community that has been fighting this anti-Asian violence since the 19th century, when Chinese immigrants were banding together to go to court, to form their own benevolent associations. All that stuff has been happening. So you actually have no excuse for not getting involved.
And we should point out to anytime we do any reporting around this thing that everyone tells us, anyone who's been working in this space for years and years and years, as people have, is that there are local community groups who have been doing this. And that's the best place to start, because when you look at where these hate incidents are happening, it is really across the country, largely in urban areas, but it's not one coast or the other, one city or the other. They are really spread out across the country. So there is a very real chance that there's already a group working to make sure people there feel safe. Yeah, before I let you go, I have to ask you about the book, because you do one of the most beautiful and elegant jobs of blending together your own life experience, your own memories, the stories you have gathered with these wonderful stories. And of course, The Committed is out now. It picks up where The Sympathizer left off, if I'm correct. And don't tell me too much, because I haven't been able to read it yet. But do tell me a little bit about the story, what people should know.
Okay, I'm just going to promote myself for like 10 seconds and then we'll get back to the larger issue. But you know, look, The Sympathizer and The Committed are two novels that take on the question of the Vietnam War and French colonialism and their impact on Vietnamese people and Vietnamese refugees. But the larger point is, look, you know, this is, again, not new. Each of our specific populations can point to our individual histories. Mine has been that my parents were born under French colonialism. I was born under a period where the United States was in Vietnam. My entire life has been shaped by the Vietnam War. And these novels are my attempt to say, look, it's important to talk about the Vietnam War, but let's connect it to this much larger history of colonialism, of which the United States is a part. Let's understand that all these wars that the United States fights in Asia are not isolated, they're not disconnected. They're part of a much larger project of American imperialism and colonialism that dates back to the foundation of this country. So the novels are a response to that kind of history. And the last thing I'll say is, look, it's great that our Asian American celebrities and artists and actors and storytellers are speaking out because they have visibility. Okay, people are not necessarily listening to our Asian American doctors and engineers and lawyers. Those are all noble occupations. They've helped to build the Asian American community. But seriously, we need our activists, our storytellers, our representatives to tell our stories and to fight for us at the level of demanding a change to the narrative of this country. So those of you who are parents out there, do not discourage your children from becoming storytellers and activists and politicians. We need them as much as we need the doctors and the engineers and the lawyers. This is the time when all of our efforts to tell Asian American stories is at least somewhat paying off, because we have people who can tell these stories now, who can contest the dominant American version of history that has excluded, marginalized, and erased Asian Americans, which is the predecessor to killing them. First, we distort them at the level of stories, and then we feel it's justified to kill them. That is the connection between racism, storytelling, and the violence that we're seeing today.
So let's bring this full circle then before we sign off, which is this point you started with at the beginning and you mentioned here now, this issue of representation, this issue of platform, this issue of who gets to tell their own story. There's obviously a Hollywood media component to this. There's a storytelling component to this. There's access to power. All of these things intertwined in this moment. If you had to tell people out there, not just to the parents, but if you had to tell everyone out there what they can do right now to seek that agency, to take advantage of their platform, because everyone has one right now, what kind of advice would you give people right now? Where should they start?
Well, the slogan is representation matters, and I think that's absolutely true. But you should always say representation matters, but it's not enough, right? So wherever you find yourself right now, whatever institution you're in, your career you're in, what stage of your life, look at your institution. Is it adequately representing people of all backgrounds, including your own background as an Asian American? And if it isn't, what can you do? So representation is partly about appearances, like who gets the airtime to speak, who gets their face in a certain place, and all of that. So to some extent, we're
Oh, guys, I'm not sure if you're still with us. We seem to be having a little trouble with Viet's connection.
whether it's a school or a corporation, industry, or any kind of industry, the change starts from within. This is another way that you can become involved is in your own location. Look around, see the injustice, see the inequity, use your expertise in your particular area to demand that your institution live up to the rhetoric. It's not enough just to say stop anti-Asian hate, because if you don't actually reform every institution so that it's responsive at the level of anti-racism, so that it's bringing in diverse peoples of all backgrounds, then of course we're going to see this repetition. These eruptions of violence are manifestations of a wider spread issue of inequity throughout our country. And if we think about the entire country, obviously it's overwhelming. So just think about your particular location, your particular institution, and focus on what you can do to change it and transform it.
Viet Thanh Nguyen, writer of beautiful stories, speaker of whole truths we all need to hear. It's such a pleasure. I'm so grateful to you for making the time. It's always, always good to talk to you. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Guys, to everyone out there, thank you for hanging with us as well. We'll be back here again sometime soon for more topics that we need to talk about and invite you to join the conversation. Of course, you can follow all of the developing headlines, especially on this story that broke overnight out of Atlanta. Go to the NewsHour online, follow us on social media. You can follow me on Twitter at I am Amna Nawaz, and right here on Instagram at Amna on PBS. And Viet, where should folks follow you to keep up with the latest?
Viet_T_Nguyen at on Twitter or on Instagram.
And I encourage you to follow Viet as well. Okay, guys, we're signing off for now. Please stay safe, be well, and we'll see you again soon.